Hey, so do you like tarot cards? Okay, wait, this isn't gonna work. Hold on. That's better. So I think it just kind of makes sense that The King in Yellow, a famous series of horror stories tied to the Cthulhu mythos, TTRPG, and all kinds of other media, would also have its own tarot deck. The King in Yellow and occultism go together like Hildred Castaigne and destroying the vibe at the function. It just works. But when I say that Arcdream, the indie publisher also behind the invaluable annotated edition of The King in Yellow, has done some really brilliant work with this deck, I need you to know that I'm not exaggerating. Before we continue, I want to give a quick thank you to the Order of the Orb Fox, our English club members, and everyone who supports us over on Ko-Fi, as well as you, the listener, for coming to club today. Thanks to a recent uptick in club attendance, we're able to make videos like this one. Really, many of the videos that I've been making recently wouldn't exist without your support, but of those videos, this one would probably be the least extant. Thanks again for being here, and let's get into it. One of the key components to the best additions to the Yellow mythos is that they always make extremely consequential claims about reality, and they offer us new ways of perceiving it. The original stories do this, of course, but so do the best instances of secondary King and Yellow media. The Star in Yellow may be a My Little Pony fanfiction, but it also asks us to engage with the medium seriously and raises relevant questions about what canon is in literature and who gets to decide it. Meanwhile, the 2018 found footage horror film The Nothing dares to say, look, we all know that art in abstraction is inspiring and that's good, right? But what about when that inspiration does harm to people? That's an interesting question. See, you might be wondering, how does a tarot deck, which is not a story, achieve this kind of storytelling, right? How does it ask us to see the world from a new angle? So like a lot of tarot decks, this one comes with a little booklet. Usually those will contain information about the artists who designed the deck, a description explaining, what distinguishes this deck from others, and a simple guide to interpreting the cards. But this booklet is different because it actually contains no guide at all. There are no instructions for how to interpret the pictures on the cards, nor even anything describing how they look. Instead, the booklet is almost entirely a story about the deck's origins. According to the booklet, the King in Yellow tarot deck was at one point a one-of-a-kind deck related to the infamous play, The King in Yellow, which originated in Europe during the late 1800s. We all know this part of the story. The play made people go insane, so it was widely censored and destroyed, though a few copies did manage to circulate in artistic circles both in Europe and the United States. However, the play did not inspire the tarot deck, nor did the deck inspire the play. Rather, both were created independently. They were both the same existential dread, the same entity manifesting in multiple artistic disciplines. According to legend, says the booklet, the King in Yellow deck contained only 77 tarot cards rather than the traditional 78. The missing card was the Emperor, though some say the Emperor card, which depicted the King in Yellow himself, would sometimes appear in the middle of a reading, only to vanish if one were to sort through the cards afterwards. And this is where the booklet takes a turn for the incredibly based. So according to the guide, one of the few historically confirmed owners of the King in Yellow deck is this person named Madame Sosostris. She's a clairvoyant who features as a character in both T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and Aldous Huxley's novel Chrome Yellow. And to be clear, the story being told by the booklet is fictional, as far as we know, as is Madame Sosostris. Like any character that's appeared in stories by different writers, she isn't really a single entity, right? She's an idea that's been interpreted a number of ways. But because Madame Sosostris' gender identity, to say nothing of her extremely feminine gender expression, is sometimes in question or is at least ambiguous in the novels and poems in which she's appeared, the authors of the booklet have chosen to interpret her as trans. And I just want to say, hell yeah, it feels really great to be openly acknowledged, explicitly welcomed into this deck, which is not otherwise a queer tarot deck. I wasn't really expecting that, to be honest. It was just such a pleasant surprise on top of what is already probably my new favorite deck of tarot cards. I've always had this feeling that, despite the very cis and very straight relationships that we often see at the center of King and Yellow stories, I have this feeling that there's something very queer about the whole business. And that's something I'm going to dive into in a later video, but for now I just want to acknowledge how nice it feels to be acknowledged, basically. it's nice to know that somebody else sees, the same queerness in the King in Yellow that I'm seeing. If I'm crazy, I'm not crazy alone. Anyway, the booklet has a lot to say about Madame Sesostris' alleged biography. It traces her all the way back to Herodotus and then forward again into the 16th century, and it's a really delightful read, one that does a super good job of blending actual literary history with alt history elements. In the end, the authors of the pamphlet write, "From an arcane perspective, we note that disguising one's gender could protect you from various forms of sympathetic magic, and therefore it could have been a practical choice by an occultist who may have had jealous rivals coveting her unique tarot deck. On the other hand, Sesostris may simply have been a transgendered person. Many cultures, both ancient and modern, include magical roles for non-binary practitioners, and this essential nature of her being could have been key to her abilities and reputation. Or it could have been nothing more esoteric than her living as her most authentic self." After the First World War, Sesostris allegedly allowed 100 copies of her one-of-a-kind King in Yellow deck to be produced, and they were sold off to various people that she was close with or that she thought, could be trusted or were just very wealthy. But all of those then gradually disappeared, as did Sesostris herself in the 1930s during a steamship trip from London to New York. The deck that we now have, the booklet explains, is a reproduction based on a cache of photographs that the publishers were able to find recently. Though the booklet's authors cast some doubt as to whether the deck will have maybe the exact same powers or properties as the original, as trying to reproduce these cards from blurry photographs is maybe not the most accurate process. The book then outlines one suggested spread, which, if I may offer one light critique this early in the video, I will say that this spread that they suggest is not suited for beginners. I would feel daunted trying it myself, to be honest. The booklet then ends with a word of caution. "Use it judiciously and respectfully," the authors say, or better yet, not at all. So let's read from it. So the tarot cards that we know best today, the deck that's variously called the Rider-Waite Tarot, the Smith-Waite Tarot, the Smith-Rider-Waite Tarot, or some other combination of those names, was developed by the occultist Arthur Waite, artist Pamela Coleman Smith, and publisher Rider and Son during the first decade of the 1900s. Smith and Waite did the most work, and they squabbled a bit over how certain cards should appear, which is why some say you can't easily make out Smith's signature on cards like the Fool, for example. She didn't like the design that Waite was really insistent on, and so she didn't really want to quote-unquote claim it. In any case, though the use of tarocchi cards, which were originally both game and divination cards, dates back to the Middle Ages, it was Smith and Waite that unknowingly laid the groundwork for almost every tarot deck to come after them, both by deciding which cards would be included and what images would be depicted on the cards. Arthur Waite was a really influential member of this occult religious order called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was one of many similar such organizations that were really popular during the early 1900s in the urban centers of the US and the UK. And as a result, much of the visual symbolism that he and Smith sort of put on the cards draws on the Hermetic Order's religious teachings. Today, though, nobody really gaff about the Order of the Golden Dawn, except for, I guess, historical reasons. And so the meanings of the cards don't really rely on what Waite said they mean. Like it or not, the quote-unquote default meanings of the cards today are much more influenced by, I would argue, word of mouth, books like Robert M. Place's The Tarot, History, Symbolism, and Divination, which is a fantastic book if you're interested in the history of tarot and how to use it to divine. And also popular websites like Biddy Tarot and Labyrinthos, which I'm sure are drawing their information from all kinds of sources, both historical and probably also likely vibes-based. Many of the cards in the King in Yellow deck are in direct conversation with their equivalents in the Smith-Rider-Waite deck, but before we take a closer look at them, I want to pause and acknowledge just what a good fit the King in Yellow is as inspiration for a tarot deck, beyond just the fact that both things are kind of spooky. Tarot, having been developed in medieval Europe, is absolutely full of Catholic imagery. One good example is the Three of Pentacles. Today, this is often read sort of generically as the teamwork card, but looking at Smith's imagery more specifically, it depicts a monk, a craftsman, and one other guy with a weird robe. He could be a merchant or maybe an architect or noble, coming together to build specifically a cathedral, a Catholic structure. Meanwhile, temperance, strength, and justice, three of the cardinal virtues in Catholicism, each have their own card dedicated to them, and Judgment depicts a specifically Christian interpretation of the end times, with an angel sounding its trumpet as the formerly dead rise from their graves. So while it definitely does seem and is intuitive for an occult set of stories like The King in Yellow to have its own dedicated tarot deck, it also makes sense on like a deeper, more meaningful level, I think. Just as the tarot has this complex history of working alongside and against Catholic spiritual tradition, it co-opts these sacred concepts that are normally under the aegis of the church and repurposes them for a more individualistic, less controlled spiritual end, sometimes that even defy biblical teaching directly. So too does Robert Chambers' own Catholicism show up in The King in Yellow in ways that are definitely not always orthodox, as we've seen throughout this series and will continue to see going forward. Anyway, before we move on, I want to clarify that when I say things like, this card usually means X, what I mean is that that's the meaning that I have inherited, amalgamated, and intuited for myself as well. It may not be exactly in line with your or anybody else's interpretation of the card, but it's also just not completely made up. I didn't pull it out of my hat here. It's been inspired, at least in part, by the pictures that are literally on the card, by Robert Place's book that I mentioned, and by miscellaneous other sources. But okay, that's enough hedging. Let's finally take a look at these cards. One of the first things I noticed about the King in Yellow deck was that the Hierophant and the High Priestess, which are sometimes also known as the Pope and the Papess, have been replaced by Jupiter and Juno, the Roman equivalents of Zeus and Hera. Apparently this choice is a reference to the Tarot de Besançon, which was popular in the 1800s, especially in the region where Germany and France kind of butt up against one another. It's believed that the swap was made from the Pope to the Hierophant to avoid sparking religious disputes in a region where Protestantism and Catholicism were frequently clashing at the time. In divination, Juno and Jupiter still generally mean the same things as the High Priestess and the Hierophant, though it isn't uncommon, according to what I was able to find, readers who prefer the Besançon deck saying online draw on cards specifically mythological associations, tying the Juno card to marriage, for example. So let's take a look at the Juno card. The High Priestess typically represents inner religious experience that isn't necessarily tied to any particular institution or system. Perhaps that's why Juno in the King in Yellow deck is afraid of the book at her feet, which represents maybe doctrine. In a way, this card becomes kind of a neat encapsulation of the tension inherent to learning about tarot. Many of us tarot readers came to the cards seeking an escape from religious orthodoxy, but still interested in pursuing personal religious experiences. We want to understand the cards, but then we immediately run into a problem, right? Because, like, what the fuck do all these pictures mean? And at that point, we are forced to either make shit up or rely, at least in part, on what previous readers of the cards have argued they mean. We return, in a sense, to doctrine, though it is certainly a much, much looser doctrine than what most religions offer. The book on this card is also very obviously nodding to the King in Yellow itself. Juno wants to know what spiritual wisdom it might offer, but is also afraid, if the chains and her expression are anything to go by, of the ways in which she might be changed once she allows herself to have those experiences with the book. Next up, Jupiter. When it's upright, the Hierophant often represents institutional religion in like a neutral descriptive sense. However, this card can also be said to represent moral authority or institution more generally. The Hierophant reversed is often read as meaning institutions misusing their power, or alternatively, the subversion or negation of institutional power. So even reversed, the Hierophant can be like a quote-unquote good card. Based on the readings I've done in my own life, I've found that a lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with the idea that the upright Hierophant, this authoritative man, should get to be the embodiment of what is capital G good, like I said, moral authority. I think the discomfort there can be summarized with the question, aren't people, at the very least, more complicated than that? Does it really make sense to make this one guy the embodiment of moral uprightness? The Jupiter card in the King in Yellow deck seems to be grappling with that very same issue. Here we see not Zeus, as the name of the card might imply, but rather a man who's dressed like a Catholic cardinal grinning as two figures flagellate themselves in front of him. Here, the upright version of the card shows power being used for, at the very least, morally dubious ends. I love that this card, which at first avoids Catholic association by changing its name from Pope to Jupiter, then affirms it by depicting Jupiter as a distinctly Catholic figure. It's paradoxical in a way that is so fittingly King in Yellow. Before we compare more tarot cards to their Smith Rider-Waite equivalents, I would be remiss not to talk a little bit about the Emperor represented here, as I said, by the Yellow King himself. The first thing that jumps out to me about this card is how elf-like the king looks. He's wearing a mask, that's not his actual face. It kind of looks like he's holding his chin, but if you look a little bit closer, you can see he's actually holding up a mask. But in any case, the mask is elf-like, and that probably means something. It kind of reminds me of Goethe's Erlkönig, if you've heard of that poem, though a lot of us here in like the Anglophone world aren't as familiar with it. Anybody who has ever learned German has had to memorize this poem at some point. The poem was written by philosopher, scientist, poet, novelist, and probably some other ists, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, in the late 1700s. The poem is about this man and his child fleeing in the dead of night through the woods on horseback, desperate to get home before the child dies of a fever. The child hallucinates, or maybe because he's in, like this liminal state on the brink of death, is able to perceive a mysterious figure known only as the Erlkönig. The latter part of that name, König, means king, but the former part, Erl, doesn't really translate. It's kind of a nonsense word. So it forces both interpreters and translators of the poem to either bake their own interpretation of the figure into any attempts to even describe him. If they call him an elf king or something like that, that implies that they have already assigned meaning to him. On the other hand, they can do what I've done so far and just continue to refer to the king as the Erlkönig, regardless of what language they are speaking, which adds a further layer of strangeness to this already ambiguous individual. I guess I'm like a little bit behind on Erlkönig scholarship these days, because I was surprised to see that a lot of the translations that I was finding online choose the latter option. They just say Erlkönig. When I learned this poem in middle school, we were taught very definitively to think of this guy as an elf, but in the sense of like evil fae that lure kids into the woods and kill them, right? Like not so much high fantasy elves as creepy evil fae elves. So yeah, the dad and the son are fleeing through the woods, and the Erlkönig makes multiple attempts to get the child to follow him off the path by tempting him with promises of like toys and entertainment and that kind of thing. What makes the poem so scary is that though the Erlkönig does kill the child, we actually don't ever find out like how he did it. At a certain point, the king gets really frustrated, and he says, "Und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt." Or basically, if you're not going to come willingly, I'm not above using force. Then the child says, mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an. Erlkönig hat mir ein Leids getan." This is like the climax of the poem. In English, the child is saying, Dad, the Earl King is touching me. He's injuring me. And then the next thing we know, the kid is dead. The superficial connections to the King in Yellow, I think, are pretty obvious. In both cases, we have these supernatural kings who can be seen by some people, but not by others. These kings usher in death, and they are known for their flowing robes, like the King in Yellow's scalloped tatters. The Erlkönig is known for his crown, yes, but also for his white robe or veil. There are some deeper connections too, though. Both the EK and the KIY ask us to investigate whether or not we can verify their existence, or if we are simply attributing agency to what could be better explained naturalistically. Was it really reading The King in Yellow that drove Hildred mad, or was he unduly influenced, a la The Nothing, by an ordinary book after having sustained massive brain damage post-fall from horse? Did the Earl King take the child to some spiritual dimension in the woods, or was the child's dying brain just conjuring up stories that helped him understand his situation better? In neither case are we able to divine the correct answer, as we might have been asked to do in like high school English class. I think we are much better served by just dwelling with the profound discomfort that emerges when we realize we simply don't have enough information to make a judgment call. So far, we've been talking pretty exclusively about the major arcana, so let's dip into the minor arcana for a second. In the Smith Rider-Waite deck, the Two of Swords depicts this figure seated on the shoreline. They're blindfolded and they have a sword in each hand. This card represents the uncertainty inherent to decision-making. The figure is between the land and the sea. They hold apparently two identical swords, suggesting that both choices that they are between could be of equal merit, and the blindfold suggests that they cannot quote-unquote see the outcome of their decision. They must operate based on limited information. Meanwhile, the Two of Swords in the King in Yellow deck presents a far less neutral interpretation of the same concept. Here, the figure has literally been split in two by indecision, and the swords are crossed, indicating that they are not simply being weighed against one another, but have actually come into direct conflict. The figure and the swords are also floating in some kind of celestial void, perhaps a suggestion that they have become psychologically unmoored and are maybe even fatally lost in their own thoughts. This suits the King in Yellow so well. In The Mask, Alec is a character that almost pathologically avoids making any decisions to his own detriment. He's so avoidant of even his own thoughts that when years of repressed feeling crashes over him all at once, he falls into a fever and hallucinates the king. His body suffers from injury to his mind, as we kind of see in this card. Next up, let's look at the Two of Pentacles. Like the Two of Swords, this card also has to do with decision-making. The Smith Rider-Waite version shows a figure balancing two coins, which are wrapped up in an infinity symbol. Taken together, this suggests that anything might be possible with the proper management of material resources. Hence, also the two merchant ships in the background, one of which is cresting a wave as the other descends. The King in Yellow equivalent of the card shows a figure offering one coin each to two of these sinister robed guys. Here, the choice is not so much about what one might use capital to accomplish as what terrible fate one might be able to avoid. Though seemingly placid, it's pretty evident to us that the individual offering the coins is in a really tight spot from which he might not emerge safely. As in the stories in The King in Yellow, the yellow sign comes to mind. Ignorance, willful or not, is at best a temporary protection against what is to come. We all know the tower. Sudden upheaval represented by lightning has arrived, toppling the king from his once comfortable refuge above the world. The King in Yellow, though, is not so base that he needs to resort to a tactic as gauche as lightning. Instead, the tower, which you could say is sort of rising behind the moon in a way, is bathed in revelatory light, and shadowy figures plummet from its uppermost floors. Hopefully they're visible on camera, seemingly of their own free will. The disaster here is mental first. Inside the tower, whose windows glow this sickly yellow color, a truth has been realized that can be neither refuted nor tolerated, and so must be escaped by a swift descent into Carcosa. Regular English Club attendees might be familiar with the tarot cards on our logo, the Knight of Pentacles representing Andrew and the Nine of Swords representing me, Jay. In the King in Yellow deck, the Knight of Pentacles is this Sisyphean guy. He's sinking into mud as the giant coin that he's rolling up a hill is also sinking. Something sure sounds like a business major to me. Meanwhile, the Nine of Swords is one that didn't really click for me at first. In fact, the first time I drew it from the deck, I was like a little disappointed. But then it clicked and it made a lot of sense, and I actually appreciate it a lot more. So this card usually represents dreams and dire omens, which doesn't really seem to have anything to do with the urns that are depicted on the King in Yellow version of the card, but when you consider that each urn is engraved with 3 swords apiece, and that the Three of Swords represents heartbreak and other massively negative emotions, it starts to make a bit more sense. These urns might contain the remains of people who did not survive the nightmares and bad omens that befell them, amplifying what the Smith Rider-Waite version of the card usually suggests. This is probably the most unsettling card in the deck, which for me is intensified by the way the yellow-green of the urns almost clashes with the yellow background. Also, the absence of any living creatures or faces or objects that might commonly be gendered is so non-binary. A+ card, if you ask me. So, that's Arcdream's King in Yellow tarot deck. Not that I'm like an art critic who has the credentials to compliment visual art or something, but I have to say that the 3-man team who put the deck together, Daniel Harms, John Scott Tynes, and most especially Kurt Komoda, the card's artist, did a really fantastic job. There are obviously like a ton more cards that I could have talked about, but at a certain point, I think you would get more out of just looking at them for yourself, which I hope that you'll do. Looking over this deck, it's obvious just how much care went into it. I mean, at the very least, there's these 78 discrete pieces of art that you have to commission. But then the fact that they put together their own story explaining them that weaves together history and art history and literature is just, it's so great. I love it. I'm definitely taking notes for when SBU, Order of the Orb Fox Willing anyway, gets its own custom tarot deck.